These are in listen-only mode.
To the, oh, excuse me, just took a sip of water and went down the wrong pipe. Welcome. So we're on step number 5, critical path, and welcome to the seminar. So just cover off some housekeeping. First of all, if you have any questions, in the button in the bar off to the right side of your screen, there is a little chat window, so you can type in any questions. As always, we have Lauren Connor with us to cover the technical issues. So if you're having any troubles logging in or hearing me, then just fire her a quick note either through chat or email, and she will do her best to make sure that you are up and running. On the technical issue side, again, if you do have any issues, if you can't hear me, if you have any of those issues, we do, as always, record these and make those available for people after. Keep in mind the voice sync sometimes is a little bit out of sync, and especially at the very beginning when we first get started, it seems to take a moment to sort of get caught up. So it'll, be patient. It'll come around. I will have my contact info at the end of the session, and feel free to contact myself or Lauren or anyone at Title Shift if you have additional questions and so forth. So with no further ado, let's get started. Our opening thought for this session, I really had a hard time finding an opening thought because I was Googling sequencing and critical path and all kinds of stuff was popping up. And I came across this one by Brian Harris, who's a Welsh poet. And poets write words you've heard before, but they put them in new sequence. So I really was kind of, thinking about that one, and I thought, how can we take our game from good to art? And, when we change the sequencing, we can often take a project, something we've potentially done in the past, and just, really make it a work of art and really make it really, excellent. And I actually have an example of that from a student of mine. It was a construction project, and he was involved in actually 2 back-to-back construction projects. Basically it was phase 1, phase 2, and the 2 buildings were pretty much identical in design. And on the second project, they got a little creative with the sequencing, and they were able to cut the project almost in half and almost for half the price. And when he told me the story about this and how he did, I thought, wow, that's really, brilliant, because it's, they took that same project, that same build, and a lot of it was actually through the use of a crane. So if you're familiar at all with large construction projects, and all you have to do is look downtown Toronto these days, you see these huge cranes, very expensive pieces of equipment, and in the traditional kind of front to back sequencing that most people do, the crane was actually sitting idle a fair amount of the time. And in the second project, when they were able to actually leverage these suggestions, what they found is they got a much higher utilization of the crane. Hence, this very expensive resource was being used much more efficiently, much more effectively, with less downtime, which hence cut back a lot on cost. And they were also able to get things done faster because the actual jobs themselves didn't take any faster. They were taking the same amount of time, but they didn't have the downtimes in between. So instead of kind of doing the, well, let's give the crane all to this group, for a week, and then all to this group for a week, and meanwhile each of them only needed about 50%, they sort of, combined that back together and really had some great increases there. So it's, sequencing can really make a huge difference in our projects and how they run. So as always, we're going to revisit our challenges from the first session, and when we did those challenges on that first session, the idea was that we would take those and walk them through the entire process and see which of the steps can address which of the challenges, and we've identified 3 today. The first one being scope creep, nailing down requirements, and then getting the team to understand the scope. And I really kind of looked at these, and those were the ones that popped out at me, and then I thought, scope creep, it's not really that obvious. So I wanted to pose the first question to you today. How can proper sequencing help with scope creep? So Lauren's going to pop open the question box, sorry, the chat box, excuse me, and please type in your answers as to how you think proper sequencing can help with scope creep. So just type in your answers there. So if you're having trouble finding it in the navigator pane over on the default, it pops up on the right. Oh, it'll pop right up? Or in the question box. Oh, there we are. The answers are rolling in fast and furious. Okay. Okay. Keep things organized from Jordan. Absolutely. Organized step by step. From Oswaldo. Yes, totally agree. Absolutely. Better understand the timeline. Absolutely. When we do the sequencing, this really helps us understand that timeline. Thanks for that one, Nicole. Proper sequence will limit when scope creep can occur. Interesting one, Daryl. I'd be interested to explore that a little bit more if you could expand on that a little bit. Time efficient resulting in higher productivity. Yes, because now we get into that, like that example with the construction project where we can be more efficient and more, less downtime and more productive in that regard. Reduce rework. I'm wondering, Beth, what you mean by that. If you could expand on that would be great. And we'll just give it about another 30 seconds or so. Proper approvals can be received with each step. Oh, beautiful. Yes, especially if we start moving towards or even doing full-fledged agile, we really need to be thinking about, what approvals do we need, when, and, as to which steps and how that's going to flow. Okay, give it another few seconds. There's the response from Daryl. Thank you. Like someone else just said, by defining the timeline, it won't be able to make change in the step tasks that are already gone by. Oh, yes, absolutely. So we know what comes first, what comes second, and really kind of where we can go with that. If you do things in the correct order, you don't need to go back and redo them. Yes, absolutely. So you don't need to find time to do it over again. Yeah, and if we can do the right thing right the first time, huge help, huge help. Great. So thank you, Lauren, for putting that up. We'll go back to our presentation. I think I was on this project. I'm sure a few of you have as well been on this project. Oftentimes we're sequencing out our project, figuring out what's next, and then we get this wonderful little piece right here where a miracle occurs. Okay. So step 4, defining the work package and activity sequencing. So just as a touchstone as to where we are in the process. So we looked at step 1, which was our charter. We defined our scope, which was our product, and then we defined the activities, what needs to get done, and in our last session we identified who was going to do that as well as the durations and did some estimating around that. So now we put them in sequence, and the key outputs here are the network diagram, which is that joking diagram that I showed earlier, but that's a network diagram, and our critical path analysis. And we're going to touch on critical path analysis a little bit today. We're going to save critical path compression for next session when we get into the schedule. So I'm going to pose our second question for you right now, which is where should our focus be? And I'm going to leave this one a little bit vague right now. So I'm just going to leave that question open, and let's see what you guys think. Where should our focus be when we're managing a project? Okay, starting to get some answers in already, which is great. Start and end date and critical milestones. Yep, good. On critical path, great. Fit for purpose. Awesome. I love it. Thank you, Oswaldo. If we're not creating something that's going to fit the purpose, then we're wasting our time and money. Beautiful. Our focus should be on scope management. Yes, it's such a foundational piece. Planning and scheduling with the end in mind. Love it. Yes, thank you, Kim. Focus should be on the end purpose for the project, and if it is still viable, Mahesh, yes, absolutely. Oh, you guys are good. Timelines, milestone, cost, resources, absolutely. So there's a lot of different things we need to focus on, we often feel in projects where we're being pulled in 20 different directions. So I'm just going to share 2 quick stories with you. These are, real life stories. So the first was a training session that I was actually attending. And my role in it was actually to bring the projector. And yeah, the projector broke. So we had flown in the National Safety Director from Calgary, and he was visiting across the country, visiting all of the clubs. This is for a club that I volunteer with, and he was rolling out the new safety management system. And so we bring the projector, and I'd left it in the trunk overnight. This was in late October, so it was close to 0. So little note to self here: don't leave it in the trunk. So we brought in this rather cool projector, plugged it in, turned it on, and pop, bulb blew. So here we have a room of about 20 or 30 people sitting around waiting for this, presentation to go, this training session. And now the focus was on the projector. So people were plugging and unplugging it, turning it on and off. And one guy actually picked it up and started shaking it. And I kind of sat back and just watched, and I thought, this is actually the epitome of the issue, is we're distracted by minor details. As a good presenter, he showed up with his slides all printed. He was there to have a discussion with the team from Ontario. So, how about if we put the projector aside, forget about it, let's just turn to page 1, turn to page 2. We've got all the information there. Where is our focus? The second story comes actually through my wife. In her high school days, there was a person she knew. I wouldn't call her a friend, but there was a girl in school who was driving her parents' car and was smoking in the car and wasn't supposed to be. And she dropped her cigarette on the ground and bent down to pick it up, and well, here's what happened. So she drove the car off the road and into a swimming pool. And that's actually a true story. So this picture I just pulled off the internet, but you get the idea. It's, where is our focus? And especially in project management, we've got so many different balls in the air, which is, which ones are we going to focus on? Critical path is absolutely an important one to focus on, but let's not also lose sight of the non-critical, because they can come around and get you. I love that a couple of you said the end result as well as the reason for doing this, because we start to go off onto this tangent, and now we're heading down a rabbit hole off to the side, and we're not getting to a good end result. Okay. Okay, so I'm just noticing there's a note in here about the sound quality, so I'll try to enunciate a little bit better, and hopefully that'll work. Okay, so thank you. Just to review, we looked at from last session we built out the business need, we built out the what, which is the product, then we got into the scope, or the project scope, which is the how, or the work that needs to get done. And in our last session, we talked about the roles, responsibilities, and estimating around that. This session, we're going to be looking at putting those things in order. And to be able to do that, we need to talk about dependencies. Now, dependencies are not about time. So when we talk about for example, finish to start, we don't necessarily, it's not like, the day that one finishes, the next starts, that kind of thing. And this becomes a little bit more evident when we talk in terms of finish to finish, which we'll explore. Now, the vast majority of your activity dependencies are going to be finish to start. One activity finishes, the next starts. So I finished digging the hole, we start pouring the concrete for the foundation of our house. That's really your most common and probably 99% of what you're going to encounter. The finish to finish and the start to start are a little bit different. And in those two scenarios, we're now into a dependency where, and we'll focus on the finish to finish for our discussions today, we're going to look at, we're actually, one's dependent on the other, so that I can not finish task A, for example, until task B finishes. So let me give you a quick little example of this. Let's say task A is to write some code, and task B is to test that code. Now, I can't finish testing the code until I finish writing the code, because as long as I write code, you need to test it. And I can't finish testing the code, I can't finish writing the code until I finish testing the code. Now, if I write the code and then you test it, you're probably going to take a week or two to do the testing, which means I'm not going to be writing code for 2 weeks, but my task is still open because I have a dependency that you need to finish and get the approval to sign off on the testing before I can technically stop writing the code. So it's not really about a timing thing. It's not like they both finish on the same day. It's that they are dependent on each other. And that can create some real havoc when we get into scheduling and planning. So sometimes what we'll do is we'll do a finish to start, but we'll do a couple of iterations through that. For example, if I expect that it's going to be 2 rounds of testing before the code is approved, then what I'll do is I'll do a finish to start where I say write code, first round, test first round, write code second round, test second round, and then I can now say, okay, let's put that in as a finished task. That has the advantage that in those 2 times when the testing has happened, I can free up the resource to go off and do something else. The other way to handle that is to do a finish to finish with a lead, where I say, okay, well, I'm going to have finish to finish, but I'm going to have a lead of, let's say, 2 days where A finishes early, that kind of thing. And we can kind of play around with our schedule a little bit, putting out the different types of dependencies, whether that's finish to finish, start to start, or finish to start, and start playing around with that a little bit to kind of get it into the schedule appropriately. So our next question for you is, what is critical path? We've been throwing this term around. We've been talking a little bit about dependencies. Oh, and sorry, just before we pull the question up. Sorry, it's already up, isn't it? That's okay. I just wanted to explore, so while you're actually looking at that question, thinking about your answers, I just want to explore very quickly the 3 other factors when we talk about dependencies, which is the mandatory dependencies, such as you have to dig a hole before you pour the concrete. The discretionary dependencies, such as the good practice ones, and I like to use this one because it is actually a discretionary dependency, which is you have to test code before you put it into production. A lot of people say, well, no, you can't. It's like, well, physically, yes, you can. It's just not a good idea. And then the third type, which is kind of an extension of the second, which is a regulatory or an external dependency. So, for example, if I'm releasing a new product, a new credit product in the financial industry, there are certain regulations that I have to meet to be able to do that. So those are the different types. Okay, so let's open up the question. What is critical path? Answers fast and furious. So longest path to the end of project in the network diagram from Mahesh. Absolutely. Textbook answer there. Critical path sequence with no float. Any delays project from Jordan. Thank you. Yes, absolutely. And we're actually going to explore that no float concept a little bit deeper today. The actions that have to be taken from Lori. Now, Lori, if I can get a follow-up to that, does that mean that things that are in the non-critical path don't have to be done? So I just want to get a clarification there. Earliest time the project can be completed from Derek, absolutely. An event that is in the highest potential risk to the timeline, quality cost of the project from Elizabeth. We're going to explore that as well. It kind of is, but it's not really. But let's explore that a little bit. And I'm just hoping that if Lori can get back to us on that other one, because I want to explore that one a little bit further as well. From Nicole, things that need path of things that need to be completed to keep the project within budget and scope. Actually, it's not. It has nothing to do with budget and scope. It all has to do with timeline and only timeline. So I can go over budget, I can change my scope and still hit my critical path. They are very tightly tied for sure, as is everything. Okay, so Lori's back. Other elements hang on it. I think of it as the shortest path to completion, which is true. So let's close that down and let's talk about this a little bit. So in kind of identifying the critical path here, I thought, well, let's put up what is and what it is not. So first of all, let's deal with what it is. Now, when we do our network diagram, we often have multiple paths. So we have 2, 3, 4, 5, paths that happen in parallel, overlapping, that sort of thing. When we calculate the length of each of those paths, the critical path is the longest, okay? And it defines the length of the project. Now, it's funny because Derek said, it's the earliest the project can be finished, right? And there's a definition out there in the zeitgeist, which is basically it's the longest path and it's the shortest the project can be finished. And a lot of people get confused around that because it's longest, shortest, what is it? So it is the longest of all the multiple paths, and it defines the length of the project, right? So that's the way I like to look at it. Now it has the least schedule flexibility. So I think it was Mahesh who said, there was no float. Well, there can be float still on our critical path, and we're going to explore that a little bit in a few minutes when we actually go through the calculation. But it's the one with the least flexibility, so it really does define the length of our project. And it's also the focus for compression. So if I need to compress my schedule and make this thing happen faster, that's where I want to focus my effort. Hence, we often refer to it as critical path compression. Now, what it is not more important than the other paths. Okay, and this is an important concept that a lot of people really struggle with. It's also not the sole focus for managing our schedule, because although we have some flexibility in the other paths, depending upon how much flexibility we have, those can come back and bite us. And in fact, depending upon the delays in the non-critical path, they can become critical path if they get delayed beyond their available float, and we're going to explore that a little bit. Just before we go there, I want to just do a quick thought experiment. So think about for a moment, we're going to build a car, okay? And I want you to think about some of the major components of a car. So things like we've got the engine, the steering, braking systems, maybe the safety equipment like the airbags and crumple zones. And, we've got the body and the chassis, major components, important components of the car. We also have some kind of what can be considered less important components of the car, like the stereo, or the entertainment system. So you then ask that question, well, which of these is on critical path? And when I poll a room and say, which of these do you think is critical path, people start citing off key elements that a car cannot function without, like the wheels or the engines or the brakes or the body or the chassis, right? Totally can't have a car without those. But in my scenario, the critical path item is actually the radio. Now, can we have a car without a radio? Well, I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, we had, cheap cars that were kind of, we call them beaters, and I had one or two cars without a radio. Car functions just fine without a radio. But in the terms of project management, the radio, because it's in scope, is as important as every other element. Now, we can make that argument that, well, we could take it out of scope. Yes, but now we're into a change request. So assuming that we're going to keep our scope static, regardless of how critical the item is to the functioning of the resulting product, does not make it critical path. So if my engine's installed, if my transmission's there and tested, if the body's in, if the airbags are installed, if the radio's on back order, or if we're waiting on the radio, then that is our critical path. It's all about timing. Okay. Now, again, it's not to say that critical path is more or less important than any other element, because you remember, in a project, until we've delivered all of the elements, we have not come to completion. So we're going to continue on with some definitions. And when you get into the discussion of critical path and network diagrams, we usually get into terms like early start and early finish. And quite simply, these are the planned start and planned finish dates of our activities. So when we put our schedule together, which we're going to look at in our next session, the day that starts and the date that it finishes, those are our early start, early finish, and that's how we typically represent our schedule. So in terms of, definitionally, look in products like MS Project and any of those other ones, and you'll see the term early start, early finish. And this is the earliest based on the plan that we can start it, and the earliest based on the plan that we can finish it. Now, the late start and the late finish is the latest I can do that without impacting the project schedule. Okay. So when the late finish and the early finish match, we have zero float. We have zero flexibility. We need to finish that on time. Otherwise, we're going to impact our schedule. So float, quite simply, is your flexibility in your schedule. How much can I delay this without impacting my project? Schedule flexibility is really what it boils down to. It's also referred to as slack. You'll also hear the terms free float and shared float. And free float is when we have float that's not going to impact anything else, and then share float is ones that when we delay one, we're going to delay a second one, but we also, it's not going to impact the overall project. Okay. So let's take a quick look at an example, because this is a great way to really kind of walk through this. So here we have our project. We have, I never bothered to count these, 4, 5, 8, 9 activities, 9 work packages. So a nice little simple example. And when we're doing the math on this manually, we always start with 0. We add the duration, which is the number in green. So we start at day 0, we add 3, we carry that forward, and so on. And you know, for anyone preparing to write their network or to write their PMP exam, you want to know how to do this. Real-world practitioners, what you want to do is, you know, engage some software, use MS Project or the like, and you'll be able to kind of work through this. So we carry the 3 forward. We carry the 3 forward to B, C, and D because it is dependent on A, and then you know, B, we add the 1, we carry that forward, and so on. Now, I've paused here on F because you notice we carried the 8 forward. And the reason for that is we, sorry, Kim's running into some technical difficulties there. The reason we carry the 8 forward is because it's dependent on C and D. And D goes all the way to 8. So if I finish, or if I start, excuse me, if I start F on day 6, well, D is not done, and I can't do that because of the dependency. So when we're moving forward, we carry the bigger number forward. So I'm going to continue that out. And by doing this, what we do is we actually figure out what our overall length of our project is, and we call this a forward pass. So we're able to carry that forward, and we figure out, in this example, our project is 16 days. Now, we're going to take that same number and we're going to carry it backwards. So we're going to start with I. Its late finish is 16, because if I finish I any later than 16, I'm delaying my project. So now I subtract the duration, and I do the same with G. And you notice that G has 16. We subtract the 5, and we get 11. So G goes all the way to the end, so I can actually delay that all the way to 16 and still not impact my project. But you notice the early start of that one's 11, so we've actually got float on that one there. And as we continue the calculation, we're going to see how that works. Now you notice that H has a finish to finish on I, so it actually can finish as late as 16. And then depending upon the actual finish to finish relationship, I would do my early finish as 16, because if I can't finish H when I finish I, it just depends upon which way that relationship is, because if it's H can't finish until I, or I can't finish till H. Again, we're going to continue to work backwards here. I'm going to pause at D again, noticing we took the smaller number backwards this time instead of the bigger number forward. So a quick way I like to use to remember this is say forward plus bigger. So forward, I'm adding my duration, and I'm picking the bigger number if there's a choice. When I go backwards, I'm subtracting my duration, and hence I'm taking the smaller number, so forward plus bigger, backwards minus smaller. So we'll finish this out, and an interesting thing with this is you'll notice that we end up back at 0. So one of the nice things with this, and if you are doing this manually, I highly recommend do the forward pass and the backward pass, because it will actually cross-reference each other and let you know that you've got it right. Now, we're going to deal with the float. And the float is really just the difference between the early and late. So I'm going to take my late finish, I'm going to subtract from it my early finish. And 3 from 3 is 0. Now, I take 9 and subtract 4, and I get 5. So what that's telling me is on B, I have 5 days of float. I continue on down and subtract them all out, and you'll notice that you have a bunch of zeros. And your critical path is quite simply trace the zeros. Now, what created the zeros for us is the fact that we used the same number in our backwards pass that we generated from our forward pass. And what I mean by this is we did our forward pass and we determined the overall length of our project was 16 days. When we did our backwards pass, we used that 16 as the number to carry backwards and do our calculation. So hence we arrived back at 0. If I had used, for example, 20, and I'd done the backwards pass using 20, so I said the late finish for I was 20. That would turn my float from 0 to 4. That would turn G from a float of 5 to 9. So everything would increase by a number of 4, by a factor of 4. Now, the reason I would do this is that if my mandated delivery time was 20 days, well, I do my forwards pass, it's telling me 16, and I can immediately tell that, you know what, my current plan is actually going to deliver this project ahead of the desired target date. So I use that desired target date to run backwards, and I now see how much flexibility I have on all of my paths, including my critical path. So the critical path will stay the same, A, D, F, and I. It just won't be 0. So when we talk in terms of critical path, and one of the answers that came back was it's the path with 0 float. Well, you can actually have critical path with float, so it's actually the least amount of float. So I have some overall flexibility to the entire project at 4 days, and then I can see where the least float is. Now, this can also go negative. So let's say for discussion purposes that instead of having 4 extra days, where we had a target of 20, let's say we have 4 days not enough, so we have a target of 12. So I was given a target of 12, my current plan says 16. If I use the 12 in my backwards pass, what's going to happen is I'm going to have a negative 4 on I, F, D, and A. I'll have a 1 on B, E, and G, and I'll actually have a negative 2 on C, which means not only do I need to compress my critical path of A, D, F, and I, but I also will probably have to compress C a little bit as well, depending upon where I find and where I do my compression. So if I gain a lot by compressing D down, for example, let's just say for discussion purposes that I was actually able to take D from 5 days duration down to 1 day duration, which is the 4 days I need, I actually haven't got it because C now becomes critical path because it has a duration of 3. And I still need to compress by 2 more days. So if I don't compress C, so if I do compress D but I don't compress C, I'm not going to get what I need. Now if I do D by 2 days, well then I have 2 critical paths, C and D. And let's say I compress F by 2 days, well I've now got my overall 4 days, but my critical path looks a little different. So you want to really be aware of what are the various options and how they're going to impact. And so what I recommend, and this is where the software can be your best friend, is as you make each of those adjustments, recalculate your critical path so that you can see if it's moved, if you've gained what you need to gain, you know, and what that looks like. And this is actually the reason if you work with products like MS Project, you know, you get into a very large project, 500, 1,000 lines, and every single entry you make, it sits there and goes chug, 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 because what it's doing is it's actually doing a forwards pass, a backwards pass, calculating the float, calculating the critical path, and it's rerunning that whole calculation that we just did on our simple example there. So to analyze the project in the critical path, we ask the question, well, what is the duration of the entire project? Now that I've done the critical path analysis, I have the answer to that. How much flexibility do we have? Which work packages, if delayed, will impact the project, and which work packages need to be adjusted to meet a proposed due date, and will we meet our mandated due date, right? We have the answers to those questions here now. Now, I just want to explore the float on C for a moment, and I want to compare it to B, E, and G. So we're going to look at C in the middle there, and we're going to look at B, E, and G across the top. So C has 2 days of float. Now, if I delay C by, let's say, a day, it's going to start on day 4, finish on day 7, not a problem, right? Now, notice nothing else gets impacted by that. But let's take a look at what would happen if we delayed B by 1 day. Well, yeah, it's going to start on 4 and finish on 5. But now what's going to happen with E? Well, it's going to be delayed as well. So it's going to start on 5 and finish on 7. And hence G will start on 7 and finish on 12. So that whole line is going to be delayed by 1 day. So when we look at that float and say, oh, it's 5 days of float, there's 3 tasks there, so 15 days, right? No, it's 5 days of float. And when you're managing your projects, one of the things you want to be aware of is, and it's something that scientists call the university student effect. Basically, if you give someone something to do and they have some flexibility, they'll wait till the end and do it at the very end. And, you know, guilty. Many of us are guilty of this. So I'm not a big fan of sharing the fact that there is float on a work package, especially if it's shared float at the beginning of the process, at the beginning of the string, with the team who are going to be doing it. So, and again, that's a bit of a style issue. So, you know, you want to kind of think about that a little bit, and you know, people often ask you, well, how much float do I have? How much flexibility do I have? Well, what they're kind of saying is, you know what, I'm planning to use it. So you want to be cautious on that, especially when you get into the scenario of my resource on G is, you know, really tight scheduled and they don't have flexibility in the schedule, so if I delay it, we're actually going to cause a problem. You know, and as where my resource on B would prefer to delay it, and, you know, we've got to be, you know, very cognizant of what are the impacts down the line. Now, this whole concept brings up a flaw or a weakness in the critical path method. And that weakness is that the critical path method is basically, it underestimates probabilities, or it's kind of inherently optimistic, I think is the way to really phrase that. So let's talk about that a little bit. And this is bringing us into a concept called schedule simulation, which most of you will know as Monte Carlo. Now, in an activity where we have duration uncertainty, okay, so we're starting to kind of layer in a little bit of risk. Now seems like a good time to talk about it, though. So anytime I have activity duration uncertainty, I have schedule uncertainty. Keep in mind what we talked about last time. Duration drives your schedule. So if I have some activity duration uncertainty, I have schedule uncertainty, and the greater that schedule uncertainty is, the greater my schedule uncertainty is. There's a direct correlation. But the issue that we have is critical path method tends to underestimate this. And we're going to take a look at a quick example, and this is something called merge bias. And let's just do a quick little thought experiment around merge bias and kind of get our heads around what we're talking about here. So you're about to go to work. You got up in the morning, you've had your shower, breakfast, and everything, you've got your coffee, and you're about to head down the road. You have 3 cars. Now, your 3 cars are parked in the driveway beside each other, and you can take any one of the 3 cars. Now, if you're like me, you have older cars, and, you know, sometimes you have to get that, you know, trade-off of reliability thing. And granted, my cars today in my present life are much more reliable than they were in my younger days. So let's say, for discussion purposes, that you have about an 80% chance of the car starting when you go to start in the morning, which is, you know, from a project perspective, 80% is actually pretty good. Now you've got 3, remember, and you can take any one of the 3. So you go try car A, it doesn't work. You try car B, it doesn't work. You try car C, it works. You get to work, right? So by having 3 cars, you've got redundancy, and hence you're increasing your odds of getting it done. So the 80% turns into like 90, 95%. However, in projects, as we've already defined, it's not an or, it's an and. So in the project world, you have 3 cars. They're all parked in a single lane driveway, and you have to take the car at the front of the line, which means you have to start car A, move it, start car B, move it, before you can start car C and hence drive to work. What you've just done now is you've reduced your probabilities of getting things done, okay? Because now if any one of the 3 cars doesn't start, you're not getting to work. So you've actually got 3 chances for failure. So you've increased the number of opportunities for failure versus the number of opportunities for success. And this plays out in our project when we get into, and we used a very simple example here of task A, 3 paths, A, B, and C, with 3 tasks within each. So we have a simple 9 activity or task project. So what we're going to do is we're going to put this into a schedule simulation. And if we have an 80% chance of it actually completing each individual line, when we merge that together, what we end up with is, you know, using those 3 paths, we merge them together, we end up with a percentage chance much lower. So now we take a look at this, and what we're doing here is we're using a 3-point estimate. And you can see in the screenshot here, we've got the minimum ardor, ML ardor, and max ardor. So this is the duration, right? So the minimum, the most likely, and the maximum. We've seen this formula before. We, you know, multiplied most likely by 4 and divided by 6, and yada, yada, yada. But what schedule simulation does is it puts it really into a bigger context, which is the context of how the project plan is laid out. And the way it does this is it literally reruns the project, hundreds and thousands of times over, selecting one of the 3 numbers. And what it does is it produces a chart like this. And in this example that we're using, and we got this from Hewlett and Associates, they're big names in the risk management world and project management side. And this is an example they published for one of their seminars. And they only ran this 1,000 times, but oftentimes you'll run this 10,000 times, 100,000 times, even 1,000,000. You notice what's happened is my due date or my schedule plan right now says October the 17th. But let's take a look at the dates probability. We're actually at a less than 5% chance of completing our project on time. And this is based on our planned schedule. This is what we're going to execute. This is why, folks, projects are notoriously going over time, because not only do we have optimism bias within ourselves as humans that we talked about last time around estimating, but then critical path method, because it's now merging all of these things together, is adding a concept of merge bias and adding another level of optimism. Okay? So if we want to give an 80% chance to our sponsor of completion, we need to give them 8 months in our schedule, not 6. And Monte Carlo, or the schedule simulation, will really help put this in a context that will help us understand, when we have duration uncertainty, it'll put that duration uncertainty in the context of the schedule, bringing into factors to play like the merge bias. Now, I want to tie this back to a comment that was made earlier when we asked you what critical path was, and one person said so I'm just going from memory here, it's one with most impact or risk. And while I agree with you, we should be very cautious of that. If I have a very narrow range in my 3-point estimate, and I've calculated it through using the most likely, that line could be on the critical path. And meanwhile, the wide range on my estimates, which is actually technically the high risk ones, is not on my critical path because its most likely is actually shorter, but its maximum duration is actually longer or will go past critical path. Those are the ones that are really going to come back and bite me, because what's going to happen there is my critical path items are going to run very safely, if you will, and they're going to run to schedule. And then my non-criticals are going to run long, and they're going to take over as critical path, and potentially, we get into a bit of a blind side or a bit of a, surprise by that. So, we definitely want to consider critical path as an important path to manage, but you also have to consider, what are the other paths and how are they going to interact and correlate. Okay. So we're at 45 minutes. Time to look at our case study. We've been using the Acme Corporation to decide to sell off the rocket-powered jet roller skate division. And last session we broke this down into what are some of the activities that need to be done. We're now going to ask the question, what activities can start right away? What can happen concurrently? Can we complete the move by year end? Because we want to do this for our year end, right? We want to start the new year in our new location. And you notice the sub-bullet there, which is negotiate. Just because there's a mandated due date does not mean I have to hit that due date. It means it's what they would like us to hit. So we want to enter into the discussions around how critical is that, is there any flexibility there, and so on. Like, where did that come from? So here's our work breakdown structure from last time. And we're now going to take that work breakdown structure and we're going to change it into a plan which puts things in order. So we can hire the agent, we can start to investigate locations even before we hire the agent. Let's just, take a drive around the neighborhood. Let's, start to do some bit of research maybe on the internet. We can start to design our office even before we've found a location, right? So and typically you lease industrial or office space. It's usually pretty blank and open and you can move walls and things. We could hire our contractor. We could even start to pack. I mean, if you think about a move, even before you got the location, you can start to pack. Now, again, This is about dependencies. This is not about timing. I mean, it would be kind of ridiculous to pack now when I'm not going to actually be moving for another 6 months, right? But there's a dependency there that says there's no reason why I couldn't. So when I actually build the schedule, we'll probably put a lag on that so that it becomes something that we don't want to start doing until we're very close to actually doing the move from a convenience factor. Negotiate the lease, we approve the design, we actually do the move and we unpack. Now, when we did this, I'm looking at this going, oh no, we missed something, right? Well, we've got to renovate our new facility before we can move in. So it's very common when you're doing this kind of thing. We've talked about the iterative nature of project management and how you want to you got to iterate through it multiple times. It's absolutely fine to be adding things in as we progress through. And the final step is to draw the lines. Now, if we had done the full analysis on this, we would have durations. Now that we have the layout, we'd layer in the durations, and I could calculate my critical path, and we could see what that looks like. So let's just come back to some key points here. Number one key point, I want to really stress this a lot, use best practices when sequencing. And what I'm talking about is the dependencies. Too often times I see people breaking best practice dependencies because they're thinking, I got to do this faster, I got to do this faster, I got to do this faster. Do your best practice dependencies, let the schedule play out, see how long it's going to take, and then start to have a discussion and a negotiation around, does this work, is this acceptable? And if it's not, then we can start breaking those best practice dependencies and doing things like crashing or fast tracking, which is actually supporting our second point here. Do not, I'm going to emphasize that, do not compress the schedule until you need to. Okay, so you need to really go through the whole exercise of figuring out how long this is going to take before you start compressing. Too often times I see people tackling projects, they've got it in their heads that this is a time crunch project, may or may not be, and they're already starting to push, and let's come up with a reasonable schedule, something that's obtainable before we start, sprinting. Consider your priorities. We talked about this in the first session. I think we talked about it in the second session as well. Your priorities around is cost number one, is schedule number one, is schedule number one, is scope number one. What is your 1, 2, 3 priorities when we talk in terms of that, that triangle? And which are the priorities that we're facing on this project? So it might be that, we're not meeting the mandated due date, but we actually have some flexibility in that, and time is not our number one, because you can have a mandated due date, but that's still not the number one priority. Cost might be your number one priority. So if you start throwing money at the project to get it done to a mandated due date when the due date is not the number one priority and money is, you're going to have an unhappy sponsor or stakeholder when you're done. And then the final key point here I want to just emphasize is remember that critical path method itself is inherently optimistic. So when we merge things together, and in the world of projects, by the time we get to the point of doing our sequencing and our schedule, we have our scope nailed down. And there are going to be times when we're going to adjust that and we need to redo our scope, our networking dependencies and redo that schedule. But we need to walk into this with the assumption that we figured out the scope and this is what it's going to deliver, which means we have to deliver all of those elements. And when we start merging them together, one slip anywhere is going to cause a delay. And that slip could be in a non-critical path, which then leads to a delay, because if I have very little flexibility or very little float in that area, it can very quickly and easily turn into a delay in the project. So I want to kind of keep those things in mind. And really the goal here is to create a manageable, realistic schedule, because honestly, as a sponsor, I'd much rather you say, it's going to take 2 months longer than you want it to take, and then actually deliver on that, than producing an unrealistic schedule by fudging some numbers around to get the schedule that I want and then deliver 2 months late, right? Let's try to work as partners with our sponsors and our clients so that we end up delivering something that is, or we end up planning something that's reasonable and deliverable that we can actually come through on. So we're just going to, as we wrap up here, revisit our closing thought, or revisit our opening thought, excuse me. Poets write words you've heard before, but we put them in a new sequence. So you look at some really great poetry, you look at some really good prose, and you know, these are all words we've heard before, but when we put them in this different order, they just become a work of art. And you know, if we can do that in our projects by resequencing and turning what is a good project into a work of art, we'll become artists in that area, and then you know, we'll be sought after and we'll have a much better project line.